The Roman Empire is often remembered for its grandeur, the Colosseum, the endless roads, the legions marching across continents. But tucked away from the marble cities and warm coasts was another side of Rome's story, a side history rarely remembers. Imagine an outpost, not in fertile Italy or along the bustling trade hubs of the Mediterranean, but high in the unforgiving Alps. Here, stone replaced soil, ice replaced open fields, and survival was a daily battle. This was no place for the faint-hearted, yet Rome's reach extended even here, driven by its hunger for resources and the strategic need to hold every frontier. If you enjoy uncovering these forgotten and brutal pieces of history, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because these are the stories that textbooks often leave buried. The outposts in regions like the Alps or similarly hostile terrain were not glamorous garrisons filled with glory-seeking centurions. They were small, often makeshift camps, sometimes even permanent settlements dedicated to mining or guarding key mountain passes. The Romans needed ore for weapons, coins, and construction. Gold, silver, and iron could be found in these high-altitude environments, and where resources were found, Rome followed. Miners and soldiers, sometimes accompanied by their families or local laborers, carved out a living in valleys, overshadowed by mountains that could kill as swiftly as any barbarian raid. The environment itself was the enemy. Thin air, biting cold, and treacherous terrain made daily routines an act of endurance. Roads, which in the heart of the empire stretched like lifelines across flat landscapes, became precarious, winding tracks carved from cliff faces. One misstep by man or mule could mean tumbling hundreds of feet into a gorge. Supplies were scarce, with food either imported from the empire's heartlands or scrounged from what little could be grown in rocky soil. Grain had to be hauled in on the backs of animals, and fresh produce was a luxury, not a staple. Salted meat, dried fish, and hard bread kept soldiers alive, but offered little comfort in the brutal winters. Winters themselves were long and merciless. Snow buried entire camps, cutting them off from the rest of the empire for months. Fires offered limited relief, and shelters built of wood or stone cracked under the pressure of constant frost. Frostbite was common, and without proper medical care, even a small wound could fester and claim a life. The Romans prided themselves on their engineering, but no aqueduct or bathhouse could tame the ferocity of a mountain blizzard. And yet, despite all this, Rome endured in these places. Soldiers still marched, miners still dug, and civilians still tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy. Imagine children born into these camps, their earliest memories not of bustling markets or warm fields, but of snowdrifts taller than themselves, of fathers disappearing into black tunnels to hack at frozen rock, of the ever-present fear that an avalanche might wipe away everything they knew in an instant. Avalanches were not just possible, they were inevitable. The mountains loomed over every settlement like silent executioners. A single tremor, a storm dropping too much snow in too little time, or even the sound of laborers at work could send tons of snow and ice crashing down. Ancient accounts rarely record such disasters, but archaeology gives us hints of entire sites lost, buried beneath layers of frozen earth. Imagine the terror of hearing the mountain roar to life, the air itself shaking as walls of white thundered toward you. For the people of a Roman alpine outpost, there was no escape. Once the snow began to fall, survival was almost impossible. And these disasters did more than just claim lives, they erased communities. Roman settlements in harsh regions often leave behind only fragments. Rusted tools, broken pots, coins stamped with emperors' faces. Many sites are so completely lost that their very existence is known only through scattered clues. Entire outposts could vanish in a single event, swallowed whole by the landscape. Unlike a battlefield where survivors could tell the tale, avalanches and landslides silenced everyone at once. These were not glorious defeats remembered in speeches, but quiet annihilations that left behind only frozen whispers of what had been. For the soldiers stationed there, duty was a chain that bound them to this peril. Desertion was punishable by death. Yet what temptation greater than walking away from a frozen death trap? Still, the discipline of Rome held firm. Orders were followed, watchtowers manned, and mines worked, even as the mountains seemed poised to crush them at any moment. To live in such a place required resilience that rivals any battlefield heroism. What makes this all the more haunting is how ordinary it would have seemed to those who lived it. For them, the risk of death by nature was just another part of life, no different than disease, hunger, or war. But for us, looking back, it's a chilling reminder that the Roman Empire, despite its power, was never invincible. Its people were not just conquerors, but also survivors, enduring not only enemy blades, but also the raw, unstoppable force of nature itself. When we think of Rome, we often imagine marble cities, feasts, and emperors draped in purple. Rarely do we picture a soldier in a snow-covered camp, his breath freezing in the air as he stands guard against both invaders and the mountain above. Rarely do we picture miners hacking at frozen, or their lanterns flickering in tunnels that could collapse without warning. And yet, these lives were as Roman as those in the heart of the empire. Their struggles were every bit as real, every bit as important. This forgotten frontier of Rome is not about the empire at its height, basking in glory, but about its vulnerability. It is about the men and women who built lives in the most dangerous of environments, only to face disasters no army could fight. Their story is not written in triumphant inscriptions or marble statues, but in broken bones and buried ruins. And it begins with the simple, haunting fact. Sometimes Rome did not fall to enemies, it was buried by the land itself. This is just the beginning of the story of Rome's forgotten alpine frontier. In the parts to come, we'll uncover the evidence left behind, the terrifying disasters that struck, and the human cost of Rome's hunger for expansion. These are not tales of emperors and generals, but of ordinary Romans lost to the snow, whose stories deserve to be remembered. The Alps were never quiet, but to those living in the Roman outpost, the sounds of nature were just part of the background. Winds howled through narrow passes, stones tumbled from cliffs, rivers crashed and foamed in their rocky beds. Yet there were subtler noises, sounds that belonged to something far more massive, far more dangerous. At first, they were so faint that few paid attention. A creak echoing across the valley, a low groan that seemed to come from nowhere, or the sudden snap of ice echoing like distant thunder. To the Romans stationed there, these were likely dismissed as the natural complaints of a harsh and hostile land. But what they did not know was that they were hearing the slow, deliberate movements of a glacier preparing to break. The science of glaciers would not be understood for another 2 millennia. To these people, the mountain was simply a mountain, fixed and eternal. The idea that ice could move, that something so massive could shift and grind forward like a living creature, was beyond their imagination. They had no way to see the giant that lived above them, stretching across ridges and valleys, holding back an ocean of frozen weight. And so, when the first warnings came, they misread them. Water, for example, may have been their first true sign. Springs that had flowed reliably might have suddenly swelled or gone dry. Streams could have changed course overnight, or pools might have appeared where none existed before. For a miner, soldier, or farmer, these changes might have been explained as tricks of the gods, or perhaps signs of seasonal change. No one suspected that the shifting water was caused by the glacier above them, damming rivers with its slow creep, storing pressure like a coiled spring. Imagine the tension of daily life in such a place. Men hauling or from dark tunnels, women tending fires in cramped huts, children playing on paths cut into the mountain face. All the while, above them, tons of ice and rock were inching forward, alive in a way no Roman could comprehend. The people might have noticed the strangeness, but chose to ignore it. After all, what choice did they have? Survival in the Alps required a constant negotiation with danger. Avalanches, landslides, and storms were all familiar killers. A few odd sounds or strange streams were hardly enough to abandon everything. The creaking of the glacier would have carried through the valley like a voice, sometimes sharp and sudden, like timber splitting under an axe, other times deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant drums. These noises to modern ears would have been a clear sign of stress within the ice. To the Romans, they might have been dismissed as rocks, shifting, or mountain spirits expressing displeasure. Perhaps some even grew uneasy, whispering about omens and sacrifices to appease gods who clearly disapproved of their presence in this frozen land. What makes this even more haunting is how the warnings built suspense, a tension that grew silently until it was unbearable. The glacier was not a sudden invader. It was a creeping executioner. The inhabitants of the outpost lived their lives beneath a ticking clock they could not see, every day bringing them closer to disaster. And unlike an enemy raid, There was no scout to report the danger, no messenger to raise the alarm. The mountain gave hints, but they were in a language the Romans could not read. Let us picture a day in that camp. The miners rise early, carrying their tools into tunnels where the air is stale and heavy. Soldiers patrol the rough perimeter, stamping their feet to fight off the cold. Fires, smoke, and spit in the wind, filling the camp with a haze. Overhead, the clouds part briefly, and the ice gleams in the sunlight, a vast, silent mass. Then, a sound splits the stillness a crack, sharp as a whip. Everyone freezes. Eyes turn to the mountainside. Nothing moves. The sound dies away, swallowed by the wind. After a few nervous laughs and muttered prayers, life resumes. But somewhere deep inside that ice, a fracture has spread. The glacier has shifted another inch closer. It is easy, with hindsight, to wonder why no one fled. But where could they have gone? These settlements were not casual outposts that could be abandoned overnight. The roads to safety were treacherous, long, and often impassable in winter. Supplies had been stockpiled for months, and leaving meant starving in the wilderness. For the soldiers, duty bound them to stay. For the miners, their livelihoods depended on the ore hidden in the rock. And for the families, where the soldiers went, they followed. It was not ignorance alone that kept them there, it was necessity. The glacier loomed like a sleeping beast, whispering its intent through groans and cracks. But to the Romans, those whispers were just another part of the wild landscape they had sworn to tame. They knew storms, floods, and avalanches. They thought they understood danger, but what came for them was beyond their knowledge, a force not of sudden weather, but of centuries of pressure, moving with the patience of the earth itself. And so the suspense mounted. Every creak, every unexplained change in the water, every vibration felt underfoot was another step toward catastrophe. The people carried on, unaware that they were living not just in the shadow of a mountain, but under the weight of a frozen giant that would one day awaken. The glacier was not an enemy they could see on the horizon, not a foe they could fight with walls and weapons. It was nature's quietest predator, waiting above them, whispering warnings they could not understand, preparing for the moment when it would finally unleash its unstoppable power. The day it happened must have begun like any other, with the routines of survival in a hostile land. Fires lit in the cold dawn, men pulling on worn cloaks against the mountain air, soldiers checking their equipment, miners shouldering picks and hammers. But somewhere above them, within the vast mass of ice that had been whispering and groaning for weeks, the strain finally exceeded its limits. What had been creaks became a roar. What had been invisible fractures became gaping wounds. The glacier broke free. At first, it may have seemed almost unreal. A thunderclap from the heights, echoing through the valley, followed by a shudder that rattled timbers and knocked tools from tables. Soldiers may have rushed to the palisade, eyes searching for attackers, only to see nothing but the mountain itself moving. Imagine looking up and watching tons of ice tear away from the slopes, sliding, grinding, and crashing downward. The ground shook as though the earth itself were angry, and the frozen giant finally revealed its strength. The glacier did not descend politely. It advanced with a violence that could flatten forests and shatter stone. Buildings, no matter how cleverly engineered by Roman hands, were nothing against such force. The huts and barracks of the settlement would have been crushed like toys, their roofs collapsing under falling debris. Walls, even if built with the discipline of Rome, were no match for the grinding pressure of ice that had been building its momentum for centuries. The advance was slow in one sense, but devastatingly sudden in another. Once it began, nothing in its path could withstand it. The destruction was total. Families huddled inside their shelters would have heard the sound before they saw it, the thunder of ice-grinding rock to dust. Those who ran into the open would have been blinded by snow and debris, the air filled with shards of ice, stone, and splintered wood. Horses panicked, breaking loose from their tethers. Soldiers shouted orders drowned out by the noise of a mountain collapsing. The weight of the glacier pressed down with a crushing inevitability, smothering screams beneath the roar. The Romans prided themselves on mastery over nature. They cut roads through mountains, bridged rivers, and carried water across miles of land in aqueducts. Yet here, in this frozen corner of the empire, their skill and discipline meant nothing. Against the glacier's crushing wall, engineering and organization crumbled instantly. No formation could resist, no wall could hold, no ingenuity could divert the torrent of ice. The contrast must have been striking Rome, the empire of order, undone in moments by the chaos of nature. The landscape itself was transformed before their eyes. Fields that had been cleared for grazing vanished under tons of ice and rubble. Rivers were blocked or redirected as the glacier buried their channels. Paths that once connected the outpost to the wider empire were erased, swallowed by debris. The camp, once an island of civilization carved into wilderness, became indistinguishable from the chaos of shattered rock and twisted timber. The geography was rewritten in the space of hours, leaving survivors, if any, in a world unrecognizable from the one they had known the day before. Accounts from other natural disasters in history of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, landslides, give us some sense of what the Romans here might have experienced. In Pompeii, people suffocated under ash before they could flee. In landslides recorded centuries later, entire villages disappeared beneath soil and rock in seconds. The glacier's advance combined these horrors: suffocating snow and ice, crushing force, and the noise of a collapsing world. Survival would have depended on chance being far enough from the camp when the disaster struck, or standing just outside the path of destruction. Those in its way had no chance. To understand the scale of this moment, imagine a modern building being destroyed, not by explosives or machines, but by the sheer weight of frozen water sliding inexorably forward. Now multiply that force across an entire valley. The Romans had weapons, fortifications, and iron discipline, but against this, they were powerless. It was as if the mountain itself had risen against them, exacting punishment for their intrusion. What makes the story even more tragic is that there was no enemy to curse, no invader to blame. Roman soldiers trained their entire lives to defend against human foes, yet here their discipline, courage, and swords were meaningless. This was not a battle they could fight. It was an execution carried out by nature itself. In a matter of hours, all the labor of years, roads built, mines dug, families settled, was obliterated. The silence that followed must have been unbearable. Once the ice stopped its advance, the valley would have been choked in stillness, broken only by the groans of shifting debris or the cries of survivors calling out for loved ones buried beneath the wreckage. Smoke from crushed fires would have mingled with mist rising from broken streams. The outlines of the settlement, its walls, its streets, its order would have been erased, replaced by an alien landscape of jagged ice and shattered stone. For the Romans, who had once believed they could conquer any terrain, the glacier was a brutal lesson in humility. It reminded them, in the most violent way, that there were forces beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to master. The empire could command armies, build monuments, and write laws that stretched across continents. But here, in the cold shadow of the Alps, the only law that mattered was the slow, relentless power of nature. The survivors, if any managed to escape, would have carried the memory like a wound. To witness comrades, friends, and family erased in a single sweep of ice must have been an experience too immense to fully comprehend. They would have looked back at the ruined valley and seen not a battlefield, but a graveyard carved by the earth itself. And for those who never left the mountains, their bodies were entombed forever, sealed in layers of ice and stone, silent witnesses to the day when the frozen giant awoke and swept away an outpost of Rome. When the ice finally settled, the Roman outpost no longer existed in any recognizable form. What had once been a cluster of barracks, workshops, and hearths was swallowed beneath a suffocating sheet of ice, rock, and splintered timber. The valley floor had been remade. Instead of roads and fences, there was only a jagged expanse of white and gray, a frozen grave that left no clear trace of the lives it had consumed. The Romans who perished there were not merely killed, they were erased, locked away in a tomb sculpted by nature itself. For centuries, the site lay silent, unseen, and unknowable. The aftermath of such a disaster would have lingered in memory only through rumor or fragmentary reports. Perhaps messengers sent to the nearest Roman garrison never returned. Perhaps survivors tried to tell their story, but their words were met with disbelief. Two distant officials in Rome. It may have sounded like exaggeration or superstition. An entire settlement crushed not by rebellion, not by invasion, but by moving ice. And so the story of the outpost faded, swallowed as completely by time as by the glacier itself. Yet the mountains are keepers of memory. Ice is not like soil that decays or water that washes away. It holds, it preserves. Objects left behind, even the smallest and most mundane, can remain sealed within the frozen layers for centuries. A wooden tool, a child's shoe, a soldier's dagger, things that in warmer climates would have rotted could endure in chilling detail. These fragments, trapped in the glacier's grip, transform into time capsules of a vanished world. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years. Archaeology in the 21st century has already revealed the strange ability of ice to act as a vault of history. Hunters in the Alps have stumbled upon Bronze Age artifacts once lost to the snow. Hikers discovered CIC, the Iceman, a 5,000-year-old body preserved with clothes, weapons, and even the contents of his stomach intact. If such preservation is possible for prehistoric individuals, then the remains of a Roman outpost, sealed in similar conditions, could be equally astonishing. Imagine modern glaciologists drilling into an alpine glacier and drawing up a core sample only to find not just layers of ancient snow, but fragments of Roman timber, flecks of charcoal from a campfire, or pottery shards carried down by the ice. Excavations could then uncover entire sections of the lost settlement. Collapsed barracks still lined with the iron nails of Roman construction, fragments of armor embedded in frozen sediment, or coins bearing the images of emperors long forgotten. Each object would tell its own part of the tragedy. A bent helmet could mark where a soldier was struck down, not by sword, but by collapsing ice. A cooking pot might still hold traces of a final meal, suddenly abandoned when the roar of the glacier reached the camp. A wax tablet, if preserved, could capture the unfinished words of a scribe whose hand was stilled mid-sentence. These are not just artifacts, they are echoes of lives interrupted, their last moments frozen in place. The scene uncovered by archaeologists would not look like the carefully arranged ruins of Pompeii or the grand remains of Rome's cities. It would be jagged, chaotic, and raw. Ice has no respect for human order. Buildings would be splintered, belongings scattered, and bodies, if found, contorted in positions of desperate flight or final collapse. The preservation would be brutal but honest, showing the reality of sudden death in a landscape that gave no warning and offered no mercy. For modern historians, such a discovery would rewrite our understanding of Rome's frontier presence. We know of forts, watchtowers, and trading routes in the Alps. But evidence of an entire community lost to a natural disaster would highlight not just Rome's ambition, but also its vulnerability. It would show how even the most disciplined and resourceful empire could be brought low not by rival nations, but by the indifferent power of geology. The Alps, long seen as barriers to Roman expansion, would gain a new identity. Not just obstacles, but active agents in the empire's story. Glaciology adds another layer to this reconstruction. Scientists in 2025 and beyond are able to track how glaciers move, how they bury, and later reveal what they consume. By examining ice layers, they can pinpoint when unusual debris entered the system. They can match soil samples with Roman construction techniques, confirm dates through carbon testing, and piece together the timeline of the event. What was once a mystery whispered in lost records becomes a mapped disaster, measurable and undeniable. The discovery would not only provide Roman relics, but also human stories. The skeletal remains of soldiers, miners, or their families would tell of lives spent far from the comforts of Rome. Analysis of bones could reveal their diets, their origins, even the illnesses they carried. A child's remains might show evidence of malnutrition or hard labor, proof of the challenges faced by Roman civilians stationed in this inhospitable frontier. These are the stories that no scroll or inscription records, the daily hardships of ordinary people lost in the sweep of empire and nature alike. To walk through such an excavation would be like stepping into a frozen photograph. Archaeologists might uncover a collapsed barrack where soldiers had stored their weapons, their pila and gladi still stacked neatly despite the destruction. Nearby, the remains of animals, mules, horses, or hunting dogs could lie preserved, tethered, and unable to flee. In another section, the outlines of a workshop could reveal the unfinished labor of miners who never returned to their tools. Each discovery would sharpen the image of that final day, giving voice to the silence that followed the glacier's advance. What makes this possibility even more haunting is the way ice preserves not only objects, but also moments of emotion. A pair of bodies huddled together, one shielding the other, could freeze forever the desperation of survival. A group of soldiers standing in formation, as if still obeying their commander's orders, could testify to discipline carried into death. These details, locked in frozen stillness, would echo across centuries as reminders of the human cost hidden beneath layers of snow and stone. Such a sight, once revealed, would become more than a Roman curiosity. It would serve as a warning. Natural disasters often feel modern because of how dramatically they impact us today, yet they have always been part of human history. The Romans, with all their power, were no more immune than we are. Discovering their frozen tragedy would remind us that human ambition, no matter how vast, is always subject to the greater forces of the earth. And so, beneath the silent watch of the Alps, the remnants of a lost outpost may still wait. The glacier that destroyed it has also preserved it, holding fast to the evidence of lives once lived, once lost. When uncovered, these fragments would not only tell us how Rome met its defeat on the frontier of ice, but also show us with chilling clarity how fragile every settlement is when measured against the scale of nature. History often feels like a tale of human triumph, where ingenuity and power bend the world to our will. The Romans were masters of this idea. They carved roads across mountains, raised aqueducts that defied geography, and imposed order on lands that once seemed wild. Yet, when faced with the quiet, patient movement of a glacier, all that confidence counted for nothing. This imagined outpost, erased by ice, speaks to a truth we often forget. Nature has no concern for our ambitions. The same force that allows crops to grow and rivers to flow can also bring devastation in ways we never anticipate. The collapse of that Roman settlement in the Alps, frozen beneath the grinding weight of the glacier, shows how fragile human achievement really is. To the empire, it might have been a minor loss, a forgotten garrison on a distant frontier. But to those who lived there, it was everything: their homes, their livelihoods, their lives obliterated without warning. It is this duality that carries the real lesson. Even the strongest powers can be undone not by enemies with armies, but by the silent, inevitable shifts of the earth itself. We see the same vulnerability in our own time. The Romans had no idea that ice could move with such destructive power. Just as today, we struggle to comprehend the full consequences of climate change. Rising seas threaten to swallow entire coastlines. Storms grow fiercer, fires burn longer, and droughts stretch further each year, like the people of that outpost. We often notice small warnings: a creek drying up, a shoreline retreating, an unusual season that feels off. But just as the Romans misread the creaks of the glacier or the tremors beneath their feet, we risk dismissing these signals until the disaster is already upon us. Imagine standing in that settlement on the eve of the disaster. The soldiers might have been repairing their barracks, miners sharpening their tools, children playing in the shadow of snow-covered peaks. None of them knew they were living on borrowed time. The sounds of cracking ice might have seemed distant or unimportant. Then, in a single, unstoppable movement, their world collapsed. That suddenness, the way a long, slow process culminates in a moment of violence, mirrors the precariousness of our own era. Climate systems shift over decades, but their breaking points come in hours. A flood that drowns a city, a wildfire that consumes a town, a storm surge that sweeps away everything in its path. For historians, the Roman tragedy locked in the glacier is more than a frozen moment of the past. It is a mirror. We like to imagine ourselves as more advanced, better prepared, smarter. But the truth is that we are just as dependent on the stability of our environment as those Roman soldiers were 2,000 years ago. They thought their engineering could master the frontier. We think our technology will insulate us from natural collapse. In both cases, confidence can turn into blindness. The archaeological discovery of such a site would drive this point home with stunning clarity. Imagine excavators uncovering the remains of a collapsed barrack where Roman soldiers had gathered. Their weapons still lined neatly on racks, as though waiting for a battle that never came. Imagine a miner's tools, half buried, mid-use, preserved in the instant of abandonment. These remnants do not simply tell us about Rome, they remind us how suddenly an entire human system can vanish. One day, life is routine. The next, it is history. This is why the parallels to modern times cannot be ignored. Rising seas today threaten to erase towns in the Pacific just as surely as glaciers once swallowed alpine outposts. Villages in Alaska, cities in Bangladesh, even coastal neighborhoods in Europe and North America already feel the pressure of encroaching waters. Like the Romans, many resist moving, clinging to their homes until the last possible moment. But just as with the glacier, nature is not swayed by loyalty or stubbornness. It advances whether we are ready or not. Another parallel lies in the way both ancient and modern societies interpret disaster. For the Romans, the loss of an outpost might have been dismissed as bad fortune or divine wrath. They lacked the science to see it as part of a larger system. Today, we have the science, the data, the forecasts. Yet we often treat these warnings with the same disbelief. Reports of melting ice sheets, collapsing ecosystems, or shifting climate patterns are acknowledged, but not acted upon, much like a Roman soldier shrugging off the distant creak of shifting ice. History warns us not to make the same mistake. The legacy of such a frozen tragedy also speaks to resilience. The Romans did not abandon the Alps after one disaster. They continued to build, to garrison, to mine, because survival demanded it. In the same way, we cannot simply retreat from the realities of our present crises. Instead, we must learn, adapt, and prepare. The lesson from the ice is not only about fragility, it is also about endurance. Civilizations survive not by pretending nature can be conquered, but by respecting its power and adjusting to its rhythms. Archaeologists of the future, looking back at us, might one day see the same patterns. Just as we dig into the Alps and uncover the frozen remains of Roman ambition, future historians might unearth our flooded cities or abandoned coasts and see echoes of the same mistake. The belief that human achievement stands outside the reach of the natural world. They may find our skyscrapers corroded by saltwater, our highways buried in sand, our neighborhoods overtaken by rising tides, and they will wonder, just as we do about the Romans, why we ignored the warnings until it was too late. This is what makes the story of the lost Roman outpost so haunting. It is not just a story of the past, it is a story of the present, even the future. A glacier moved, a settlement fell, and life ended in an instant. Today, seas rise, storms strengthen, and the same fragility shadows us. The Romans did not understand the ice, but we have no such excuse. We know the science, we see the evidence, and still, the question remains. Will we heed the lesson, or will our own history one day be preserved as a warning carved into the earth? And that is why this imagined disaster matters. It is not about Rome alone, it is about us. Every artifact trapped in that ice is a whisper, not just from the past, but to the future. It says, no matter how powerful, no empire, no civilization, no society is immune to the forces that shape the planet. Rome learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible, and the traces of their loss remind us what is at stake if we fail to learn it ourselves. If you found this exploration of Rome's frozen frontier and its chilling lessons fascinating, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories that reveal the forgotten, bizarre, and often uncomfortable truths that history hides beneath the surface.